Hi, welcome to part 3 in our exploration of Asian art. We're going to continue to look at art and architecture in the geographical location of India. This time we're going to look at the religion of Buddhism, which was also born in India in addition to Hinduism. So, among the founders of the world's major religions, the Buddha was the only teacher who did not claim to be other than other than any ordinary human being. Other teachers were either gods or directly inspired by God. The Buddha is unique in the fact that he was simply a human being and he claimed no inspiration from any god or external power. He attributed all his realization, attainments, and achievements to human endeavor and human intelligence. A man and only a man can become a Buddha. A man and only a man can become a Buddha. Every man has within himself the potential of becoming a Buddha if he so wills it and works at it. Nevertheless, the Buddha was such a perfect human that he came to be regarded in the popular religion as a superhuman. Man's position, according to Buddhism, is supreme. Man is his own master, and there is no higher being or power that sits in judgment over his destiny. If the Buddha is to be called a savior at all, it is only in the sense that he discovered and showed the path to liberation, to nirvana, the path we are invited to follow ourselves. Oops, excuse me. So before that annoying phone ring, we were talking about nirvana. So this idea of the path to nirvana, we are all invited to follow ourselves. It is with this principle of individual responsibility that the Buddha offers freedom to his disciples. This freedom of thought is unique in the history of religion and necessary because, according to the Buddha, man's emancipation depends on his own realization of truth and not of the benevolent grace of God or any external power as a reward for his obedient behavior. So what you're looking at here we're going to be looking at some different representations of the Buddha, and this is just some principal characteristics of a Buddha figure. We'll see many different representations, and again in many different geographical locations, and we'll talk more in depth about these. But often you'll see a Buddha with elongated ears. This is where he wore very heavy earrings. This, before he became Buddha, he was a very wealthy prince, and so this is supposed to symbolize that past wealth. Usually, you'll see him being depicted in different mudras or hand gestures that signify certain prayers or ethical ideas. The lotus position with his legs crossed, the wheel on the bottom of his feet, that's sort of a vehicle or one of his accoutrements, a wheel. And then the predella, and we'll see this is a kind of architectural, it's sort of like a register, a relief register that maybe has some sort of scene depicted from the life of Buddha. A predella is something that we'll see in Western art as well, and it's more of an architectural feature. We'll see a predella in Western altar pieces later on. So the main events of the Buddha's life are well known. He was born in Siddhartha Gautama of the Shaka clan. He is said to have had a miraculous birth, a precious childhood, and a princely upbringing. He married and had a son. He encountered an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a religious ascetic. He became aware of suffering and became convinced that his mission was to seek liberation for himself and others. He renounced his princely life, spent 6 years studying doctrines and undergoing yogi austerities. He then gave up ascetic practices for a normal life. He spent 7 weeks in the shade of the Bodhi tree until he finally, one night toward dawn, enlightenment came. Then he preached sermons and embarked on missionary travels for 45 years. He affected the lives of thousands, high and low. At the age of 80, he experienced his parinirvana, this idea of extinction itself. This is the most basic outline of his life and mission. The literature inspired by the Buddha story is as various as those who have told it in the last 2,500 years. To the first of his followers and the tradition associated with Theravada Buddhism and figures like the great emperor Ashoka, the Buddha was a man, not a god. He was a teacher, not a savior. To this day, the Theravada tradition prevails in part of India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Thailand. And so here you're just seeing some, again, different representations of different stages of Buddha's life. So this is a relief sculpture here, the Buddha. This is at the moment of enlightenment where he's meditating under the Bodhi tree. And here we see sort of an ascetic Buddha. He's very thin and, almost looks like a skeleton. His head is missing. So this is a fasting Buddha. Those who a few hundred years later formed Mahayana school, Buddha was a savior and often a god. So again, it's a lot of information, but basically what I'm saying and what I've read and the research that you're going to be presented with is that, Buddhism changed a lot, and it changes a lot geographically and so, different depictions of Buddha and what he represented will visually be able to see in art. So in the Mahayana school, Buddha was a savior and often a god concerned with man's sorrows above all else. The Mahayana form of Buddhism is in Tibet, Mongolia, Vietnam, Korea, China, and Japan. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is also known as Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni, I think that's how you say it. And this is something else you'll hear. You'll hear like this idea of the historical Buddha. This is sort of the real Buddha and his life, and then this idea of the Buddha that has become enlightened, and depending on what geographical location we're at, if he's seen more as a god or savior in the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism. When we talk about the religion that worships the Buddha, we refer to it as singular, Buddhism. However, it may be more accurate to talk about Buddhisms with an S. The religion that originated in India took on so many different forms and adapted in such a variety of ways that it is often difficult to see how the various sects of Buddhism are related. What do they all have in common? The worship of Buddha, of course. But who was Buddha? Was Buddha a man or a god? In earlier forms of Buddhism, Buddha is most definitely a man. As the religion changes and adapts, the Buddha is eventually deified. So here we see a depiction of, I think that's supposed to say standing Buddha offering protection. So anyway, Buddhism originated in what is today modern India, where it grew into an organized religion practiced by monks, nuns, and lay people. It is believed, its beliefs were written down, forming a large canon. Buddhist images were also devised to be worshipped in sacred spaces. From India, Buddhism spread throughout Asia. In order to appreciate the magnitude of the Buddha's achievement, we should try to imagine what life was like in early India, particularly in towns and villages of the Ganges River Valley, like the Kaupilavustu. I'm saying that wrong, but you can look it up in my lecture notes. in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains in what is now known the country of Nepal. This is the area in which the Buddha was likely born in about 560 BCE. Every year the river flooded, the valley destroying crops. Monsoons came every year too, creating famine. There was also severe droughts and disease such as diphtheria and cholera. Sorry. So again, obviously life in ancient times was not very easy and as comfortable as we have it today. The Brahmins, the Hindu priests, chanted the Vedic hymns, the oldest scriptures of Hinduism. So this is like kind of like pre-Hinduism, and offered fire sacrifices to Brahma, the Hindu god of creation. However, they did not improve conditions for the common man. From the earliest times, Hindu society was stratified. So we talked about that. We talked about the caste system. So castes were firmly established in the economy with the Brahmins and the creators and perpetuators of social order highly favored, obviously, themselves. So you're kind of, stuck and if you were in a lower caste, there wasn't really a way for you to, at least in that lifetime, go beyond or better yourself. So one of the Buddha's greatest spiritual accomplishments was the doctrine of the middle way. He discovered the doctrine of the middle way only after he lived as an ascetic for some time. This experience convinced him that one should shun extremes. One should avoid the pursuit of worldly desires on the one hand and severe ascetic discipline on the other. Despite his doubts about existing religious practices and his strong sense of mission, he did not think of himself as the creator of a new religion. Rather, he felt the need to purify the religion of his day. Buddha took for granted the truth of cosmological perspective indigenous to the Indus Valley, the worldview that is often associated with Hindu conceptions. One might understand what time and space looked like in the Buddhist framework of ancient India. This framework was shared by all, whether one was adherent of Brahmanism, Jainism, or Buddhism. Samsara and time. Samsara, a Sanskrit word, literally means a round or a cycle. In the ancient Indian worldview, this means the endless cycle of rebirth and death. There is no beginning and no end. The endless cycle is governed by karma, causality. In ancient India, time is measured in kalpa. There is an unending cycle of destruction, renovation, and duration. Each period is 20 kalpa long, and they are thought of as a circle. Destruction has a great beginning, but gets progressively worse. There are scourges of fire, water, and wind. Rubble is this idea of space being dark and empty. Only wind exists in this stage with the seeds of karma. Renovation, this is the phase when things build up from the bottom. Earth, metal, water, and wind. Whirling wind forms a disk of water, impurities float to the top and form a disk of metal. This disk breaks down and forms the earth. Duration is the phase of preservation. At the end of this phase, sentient beings appear. So it's almost kind of like maybe sort of like a Genesis sort of tale or creation of the universe. I know this is a lot of information, but it is important in understanding when we look at some Buddhist art and architecture. Mount Sumera or Meru is the cosmic axis. Now, this idea of a cosmic axis is something universal. It's a kind of characteristic that we see in a lot of religions. And this is the link between heaven and earth. The mountain is the center of the world in this cosmological conception, both physically and in terms of importance. on top of Mount Sumera, I think that's how you say it, are the palaces of the gods. Mount Sumera is surrounded by 7 chains of mountains, an ocean that has 4 continents. North equals rectangle, west equals a circle, south is a trapezoid shape, and um, Jambu, Jambu Dvipa is where humans live. East is a crescent moon. The universe is vertically structured. At the top is the realm of no form. This realm has no qualities. This can be perceived by senses. It is impossible to have a conception. It is impossible to have a conception of it. Next are the realms of form that can be perceived in various states of meditation. One can see pleasant sights, bright lights, and perceive coolness. Below is the realm of desire. The realm has 6 levels. This is our realm. The 6 levels are the 6 paths of rebirth. The highest realm is that of the gods, Deva. Halfway between gods and humans are demigods, Asura. Humans and animals dwell on the surface of Jambu Vipa. Hungry ghosts inhabit the shadow world below animals. This level has much pain and suffering. Beings here are always hungry and never satiated. Hell beings occupy the lowest level. There are 8 levels within this level. At the 8th and lowest level, there is no rest between tortures. So again, it's basically just a sort of symbolic sort of construction of the universe, and this link between heaven and hell, and different religions I think sort of believe in the same thing. I mean, we definitely in terms of Christianity believe in this idea or concept of a heaven and hell, and so it's not it's a characteristic that we see in a lot of other world religions. So how do beings move around this crazy world I just described? The answer is karma. Karma is the law that regulates life in samsara. Existence in time and space is ruled by karma. Karma means action or deed. Every action has a result. Every deed has an effect. Karma is built in universe scale for good and evil. Good leads to good results and vice versa. Karma governs the long term and the short term. Karma is never destroyed. In the short term, good deeds lead to a good result and bad deeds lead to a bad result. Karma transgresses from one life to another, so it kind of follows you. It determines how a being will be reborn, higher or lower. Karma is not predestination because the concept of predestination does not take into account free will. Your current circumstances are determined by deed in your previous life, but between the present and the future, there is free will. Upward mobility is possible. So this is something that is lacking in Hindu religion. What are the implications of the Buddhist worldview? Being reborn a human is rare and important, rare especially in the time of Buddha. Buddha is born only in a small time period within the phase of destruction. We are fortunate to have access to his teachings since this is limited time and place to be given the chance to encounter Buddha. A being can only encounter Buddha and benefit in the human realm. So how does one achieve salvation? All is impermanent. All is I'm trying to say cycle. I can't say it. Anyway, you know what I mean. All is painful. Even God suffers. There are only gods for one lifetime, and then they are reborn lower down. Also, gods do not have access to Buddha. Beings need to find a way out of the endless cycle of rebirth, and this is the goal of nirvana. Nirvana is extinction. Nirvana is the traditional name for that which is not samsara. Where's nirvana? Nowhere. Nirvana is outside the vertical concept of this sort of crazy universe we just described. And so that basically the idea is to kind of get beyond all that craziness and just achieve nirvana, just nothingness. I know that was a pretty lengthy discussion of Buddhism, but again, I think having the backstory is important and understanding some of the different depictions that we'll see of him. And so here we see a depiction of the Buddha, and this is actually in Japan, which we will look at much later, Japanese art. Um, so I hope I haven't confused you too much, but you know, I think you'll be okay. All right. So this is an image of the historical Buddha. We can tell it is the Buddha because of the many distinguishing marks, Lakshana, visible in the sculpture. He has a cranial bump on his head, Unisha, this is right here, a tuft of hair between his eyes, an urna, and the sign of the wheel, chakra, on his hands and the soles of his feet. The wheel signifies the teaching of the Buddha as well as his righteousness as a leader. He is dressed in a monk's robe, typically with one shoulder bare. He is seated on a lion throne. Above his head are branches of the Bodhi tree, a reference to the Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and achieved enlightenment. What was the Buddha's enlightenment? The Buddha sought answers to the problems of suffering and the continual cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, which is witnessed all around him. He rejected the path of complete self-denial, asceticism, and also rejected the comforts and indulgences of his former life as a prince. He resolved to sit under the Bodhi tree and meditate on these issues until the answer to these problems became clear. His revelation has been called the Four Noble Truths, a summation of the cause of human suffering and the possibility and pathway to enlightenment for all beings. In this course of his meditation, the Buddha was tempted by the demon Mara. Mara sent his armies various temptations, and finally, as depicted here, a challenge that the Buddha must defend his claim of enlightenment. The Buddha touched the earth and called the earth to witness his achievement. The touching the earth, which is this gesture here, you see it right here, and this kind of Buddha is often known as touching the earth Buddha, is seen as a significant gesture, a mudra, in the sculpture. This iconography of the Buddha became very popular throughout Asia. Mara can also be understood not only as a figure in the story, but also as a representation of inner temptations, mainly one's ego, that obstruct the path to enlightenment. Therefore, overcoming Mara is equivalent to overcoming the self or the ego. So, a little bit more about this image of Buddha. Based on analysis of the style, medium, and subject, this sculpture is dated to around the 800s CE and comes from eastern India. At that time, the Pala dynasty rulers were generous supporters of the Buddhist religion, and many famous monasteries and universities existed in what is now the state of Bihar. Unfortunately, most of these buildings are now in ruins as Buddhism succumbed to Muslim incursions and seriously declined around the 1100s CE. The sculpture was probably placed in a niche in a temple made of brick. We believe from the inscription on the base of the teeny figure on the lower right represents the donor. Typically of the Pala style is the tendency for the central figure to stand out against a very decorative background. The dark schist, this is a type of very strong stone, gives the statue a dramatic, crisp appearance. Here's another representation of Buddha. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the ID information. We're actually going to listen to a podcast about this particular Buddha. This is one of the first images of the Buddha ever created. It shows him in an enlightened state, wearing monk's robes and seated in the lotus position. The position of his hand indicates what is that he is revealing the Dharma, the way of his teaching. The statue would have sat in front of a stupa, a domed structure that enclosed the Buddha's ashes. So it's almost a stupa is almost like a reliquary. Pilgrims used statues like this to contemplate the Buddha's teachings before they visited his relics. When were the first images of Buddha created? Images of the Buddha were not created until over 500 years after his death. The Buddha was an Indian prince who lived around 400 BC. He became a Buddha, an enlightened one, through comprehending the roots of human suffering while living an ascetic life. Buddhism spread from India along the Silk Road and by sea, but it was not until um, between 0 and 100 AD that the first image, I'm sorry, that is not right, I think. I have to double check that the first images of Buddha were created. So basically what I'm saying is that the image of Buddha did not exist with the roots of Buddhism. It wasn't until after, very, long after his death that we start to see these images of Buddha. And other symbols represented the Buddha before these sort of typical images of the Buddha existed. Um, so before these images of Buddha, the Buddha was represented by other symbols, such as a footprint. All right, so I'm gonna stop here. We're gonna be looking at. We're gonna continue to stay in India. Oh no, we're gonna move. Yeah, we're gonna move into India and Cambodia in our next segment, and we're gonna actually be looking at some religious architecture. So both Buddhist, Buddhist and yes, and Hindu architecture. So stay tuned.